Hey there, Congressional Dish listeners. This is your host, Jennifer Briney, and welcome to the 41st episode of Congressional Dish. Now, this week was supposed to be part 2 of the Department of Homeland Security series that I'm doing. The first part was giving you some history of where the department came from, and the second part is going to be on the funding bill that passed the House back in June. The thing is, I'm going to put off that second part for 1 week because this week we are going to war, kids. Unless you're living under a rock somewhere, you know that I am referring to the pending attack on Syria. So what we're going to do in this episode is I'm going to give you some highlights of the debate today from the British House of Commons. The British House of Commons is essentially Great Britain's version of Congress. And the reason we have to look at the British debate is because our own Congress didn't even consider coming back from vacation to debate a matter of war. Now, the reason that we have to care about this is that the Constitution says that it is Congress, as in the people, that are going to decide matters of war, whether or not we get into one in the United States. And since the authorization for military force, which was given to President Bush after 9/11, the president, whether it be Bush or Obama, has taken that authorization to mean that they can decide whether or not we go to war. What's so infuriating about our Congress is they're not even trying to get their constitutional powers back. And remember, Congress is our branch, so by not trying to get their constitutional powers back, they're not trying to get the people's constitutional powers back. And in this week, more than any other week since this show began, Congress is doing a terrible, horrible job of representing the people by just straight up not being there. So yeah, we're going to take a look at what the British people were saying today about going to war. And then I also did some extra research on Syria. And before I get into the episode, there is some background stuff that you guys need to know. And it is from the 3rd episode of Congressional Dish. That was the episode where I outlined the information that, for the most part, came from Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine. If you have not yet heard the 3rd episode, I do recommend that you stop listening to this one right now and you go back and you listen to the 3rd episode. It's a much longer episode than you're used to. It's about an hour and 15 minutes. But it's kind of essential to understand where I'm coming from and what I'm looking for when I was looking into Syria. Very quickly, because I know it's been a while. Our country has been pushing free market economic reforms on countries around the world for the last 5 decades. We essentially want other countries to privatize their state agencies so multinational corporations can control their industries and former government functions for a profit. Sound familiar? Now, there's a clear pattern, and this stuff can happen in different orders, but pretty much always, economic reforms are put in by a new president or dictator or whatever. Those reforms hurt the workers and destroy the middle class while making massive profits for the people at the top. The country goes into chaos because the people get pissed. The infrastructure at some point is destroyed, which allows the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund, or the World Bank, or USAID, or some combination of the three, to come in and fix their infrastructure, which makes that country indebted to the IMF and this world power, and therefore we get control of them. And in return for the money we give them to fix their infrastructure, which it usually either gets destroyed in some kind of civil war or by us going in and bombing it. But either way, we demand more economic reforms that open up their markets to multinational corporations, and so on and so on. And when you look into what's happening in Syria, there are signs of that here because Syria is not playing ball on their own. So yeah, if you're not already familiar with what I'm talking about, I highly suggest you take the time and go back to listen to episode number 3, even though it's a long one, because you're going to really understand the significance of the things that I'm going to tell you in this episode if you do that. And I'll provide a link to that for you in the show notes. Also in the show notes, all of these claims that I'm making, I'm not an expert, okay? I know people, I've been called very nice things by you guys. I've been called a brainiac and people say I'm intelligent, but really I'm just researching what's out there and presenting the stuff as it makes sense in my head. But I'm just some girl, and in this atmosphere of ours and in our media, you should be verifying everything that someone tells you is a fact, because we just don't know what facts are anymore and no one takes the time to research it. So I don't expect you to trust me at all. If you're smart, you won't. What you should do, though, is go to congressionaldish.com, and I've provided links to get you started on your own research. Or if you just want to verify that I'm not completely full of shit, go to congressionaldish.com. I will give you links as often as I possibly can. And I've definitely done that for this episode because this is a matter of, life and death for people over in Syria, and it's in our hands. So, we need to take some responsibility here for our own government, even though they're not at work. That's what really sucks about this, you guys, is that even if we wanted to stop this, I physically don't know how we can. I really don't. It seems that the decision's already been made by the Obama administration, and Congress is gone. Our representation is simply not there. I don't know what us citizens can do about it, but we should at least know what is happening. So let's just get started.
Every time I watch the news these days, I see the same old leaders trying to lead us into wars with propaganda that they feed us. As the unelected president of the United States of General Motors plans his next move aimed to help his business partners meet their quotas, and I watch the world just step aside, waiting for their piece of the American pie.
So let's get started with the official story of why we are going to attack Syria, and it has to do with chemical weapons, something we are all very well aware of at this point. The first clip I'm going to play for you is Prime Minister of the British House of Commons, and he's going to kind of just tell you the story, the chemical weapons attack that broke the camel's back.
Let me set out what we know about what happened. Médecins Sans Frontières reported that in just 3 hours on the morning of the 21st of August, 3 hospitals in the Damascus area received approximately 3,600 patients with symptoms consistent with chemical weapons attacks. At least 350 of those innocent people died. The video footage illustrates some of the most sickening human suffering imaginable. An expert video analysis can find no way that this wide array of footage could have been fabricated, particularly the behaviour of small children in those shocking videos. There are pictures of bodies with symptoms consistent with that of nerve agent exposure, including muscle spasms and foaming at the nose and mouth.
So first question here is, did this happen? And I don't recommend looking at them yourself if you don't want to. But if you want to take my word for it, you can. I've seen some of these videos. I saw them that morning. They were being linked to on Twitter, and they're terrible. There's a lot of children that were involved, and that's the thing. Like, if it was going to be a big staged event, if this is some kind of crazy false flag and the videos are suspect, as some have claimed, which really disturbs me, I don't know any child that's that good of an actor. And there were children all over the place in these videos. So I do believe that this chemical attack absolutely did happen. What we don't know is who did it. The Obama administration is saying that it's a done deal, that we know for sure that it was Assad's, who is the president of Syria. They're saying it was his government forces that went and attacked these people in this town. There are reasons to doubt this claim, but we're going to get back to that in a minute. But what's pretty fascinating is that both the United States and the British are saying this is only about chemical weapons. That is the only reason we're attacking them, is because they used chemical weapons.
What I would say to the right honourable gentleman is the case I'm making is that the House of Commons needs to consider purely and simply this issue of a massive chemical weapons use by this regime. I'm not arguing we should get more involved in this conflict. I'm not arguing we should arm the rebels. I'm not making any of those arguments. The question before us as a government, as a House of Commons, as a world, is this 1925 agreement, post the First World War, these weapons are morally reprehensible, and do we want to try to maintain that law?
Now, he's doing some serious mental gymnastics there by saying that by bombing them, we're not getting any further involved in the Syrian civil war. But that's the kind of logic that we're dealing with here. Now, after watching as much of the debate as I was allowed to watch, and you'll know why I say that in a minute too, but as long as I was able to watch it, it became quite clear that what the British are going to do is they want to allow the UN to finish their inspections and for the UN to make their conclusions before the British House of Commons will give the okay to support an attack on Syria. And, when we were bombing Iraq, or in the lead up to that, the whole time, I was living in Bonn in Germany at the time. I was studying abroad. And, it was crazy because we had class that day, and in Europe, everything stopped. The British, Tony Blair got up there and made his case to the House of Commons, and everything stopped. We didn't go to class. You could watch it in bars. In Europe, they really gave a damn. And this part of the debate gave me major flashbacks to that day, being down in the basement of my school with my teachers and my fellow classmates and watching that debate for hours and hours and hours while they say, let the UN finish doing their job. And listen to this from today. It sounds exactly the same.
First, and this is where the Prime Minister and I now agree, we must let the UN weapons inspectors do their work and let them report to the Security Council. But Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, said yesterday about the weapons inspectors, and I quote, let them conclude their work for 4 days, and then we will have to analyse scientifically with experts, and then we will have to report to the Security Council for action. So the weapons inspectors are in the midst of their work and will be reporting in the coming days. That is why today could not have been the day when the House was asked to decide on military action. For this House, it is surely a basic point. Evidence should precede decision, not decision precede evidence.
Yeah. So, God, British Parliament is so much cooler than Congress, isn't it? But anyway, so what the British want to do is they want to have the UN have the world, because, okay, the UN started after our world wars, and it was a way for the major powers of the world to come together and decide when we're going to act as a world community against someone who's gone nutty. There's a problem, though, with this specific instance when it comes to Syria, which is that Russia has a veto on the UN, and they're down with Syria. So being an ally, they're not going to approve, by all accounts, they're not going to approve this attack on Syria. So this is the British plan, and presumably our plan too, on how they're going to justify and make it legal, even if Russia gives a veto to the resolution that would authorize an attack.
Look, the very best route to follow is to have a Chapter 7 resolution, take it to the UN Security Council, have it passed, and then think about taking action. That is the path we followed with Libya. Now, I want to make this point, because this is very important. It cannot be the case that that is the only way to have a legal basis for action. And we should consider for a moment what the consequences would be if that were the case. You could have a situation in a country where its government was literally annihilating half the people in that country. But because of one veto on the Security Council, you would be hampered from taking any action. Now, I can't think of any member in any party of this House who'd want to sign up to that. And that's why it's important. We do have the doctrine of humanitarian intervention, which is set out in the Attorney General's excellent legal advice.
Big problem here. By even being a part of the UN, we did sign up for that. We did say that Russia gets a vote here. But notice that they said that they're going to make this a humanitarian mission, and therefore they won't really need the UN. That's how they're going to try and get around international law. So the debate kind of went along those lines for hours. It was like 2 or 3 hours. But there was a fascinating exchange that happened a couple hours into this debate, where they were talking about what the repercussions could be of this attack. Now, it's funny because when you hear the Obama administration talk, they've been very clear in saying that they're not trying to have regime change like they did in Iraq. When we went into Iraq, we were trying to get rid of Saddam, okay? And Obama has said in August of 2011 that Assad has got to go, but he said that is not going to be the goal here. The goal is to have targeted strikes that are going to take out certain things and basically teach him a lesson for using chemical weapons. But there might be repercussions to that. So I'm going to play you a long clip here. This is the most fascinating 5 minutes of this debate, but is also going to be something that I'm going to remember 20 years from now in regards to our American media in the run-up to yet another war because of what happened as I was listening to this debate. So, yeah, sit back, relax, and enjoy the insanity.
My two questions are, is it proven that Assad did it beyond reasonable doubt? And secondly, even if he or his regime did it, is a military strike sensible? Now, first of all, on the question of whether or not he did it, the UN inspectors aren't going to tell us anything about that. As I understand it, all they're going to do is going to tell us whether or not a sarin gas attack took place. So we can't look to them for pointing the finger as to who did it. The JIC have been cited, and we can all read the summary, and the summary is not conclusive. The summary, in fact, says that the JIC are baffled as to find a motive for Assad having done this, and well they might be, because if he did do it, and maybe he did, if he did do it, it was the height of irrationality for him to do the one thing that might get the West intervening against him.
Would my honourable friend give way?
Yes, of course, I'll give way.
I think there is a clear motive for him to have done this. He's been using chemical weapons on a number of occasions, 5 previous occasions, testing the West to see if they were going to respond. He's lost control of Aleppo airport. Homs is still under rebel control. The rebels are fighting in the suburbs of Damascus. He's getting desperate. That's why he used it. There is no question that there's any circumstantial evidence that points to anyone else.
Exactly. I greatly respect my honourable friend's opinions on this and all other related matters, but nevertheless that would make more sense if he actually was willing to acknowledge that he'd been testing the water rather than vehemently denying that he did it. I think it's just as likely, I'm not going to give way when I'm still answering a previous question, it's just as likely that if the regime were responsible in some way, it might have been done by some part of the regime, unauthorized by another part of the regime. And indeed, this leads me to the question of contradictory evidence, because according to the leaked reports, on the one hand we're getting stories that this was ordered by Assad's brother in a retaliation for an attempt on the life of the leadership, an assassination attempt that failed. On the other hand, we're saying that there's intercept evidence that in fact it may have been the result of somebody unauthorized doing this, because there was a telephone conversation where somebody was saying, why on earth did you do this? And there was a sort of panicked reaction to unauthorized release of poison gas. The point about all this is that it is very far from certain that the evidence stacks up, and indeed we have got the Intelligence and Security Committee, and I can see no reason whatsoever that the ISC, which is cleared for classification well up to the sort of material that the JIC has been looking at and that the Prime Minister has seen, and I don't see why those of us who have been cleared for that sort of access should not have that sort of access. But I now move on to the second question, and the second question is this. Let's suppose that Assad did it. Is it then sensible to reply with military action? We've heard the arguments about red lines, and we've heard the arguments about the importance and the sacrosanct taboo that we must stand up for. But if it is the case that my honourable friend is correct and that the Assad government actually did do this irrational thing, then that shows that the Assad government is behaving very irrationally indeed. And one of the things that really does bother me greatly is that it is now being suggested, and I say this as someone generally supportive of Israel, that Israeli intelligence may be the source of the evidence that the Assad government did it. If Assad is behaving irrationally, if Assad is so desperate, what is to prevent Assad, if he is attacked militarily by us on the perceived basis of intelligence supplied by Israel, from retaliating with a chemical attack against Israel? What then will Israel do? Israel will retaliate in turn. What then will America do? What then will Iran do? What then will Russia do? I started off, Mr. Speaker, by making a reference to the First World War. And next year, we are going to be commemorating the centenary of the events of August 1914. And those events have a worrying parallel, because you had a series of actions and reactions which drew in an escalating fashion, one country after another. Nobody thought that the assassination of an obscure archduke would lead to a world conflagration. This, as Admiral Lord West has said, is a powder keg, and we should not be lobbing weapons into the heart of such combustible material.
So we're going to break away from this British House of Commons debate on Syria at this point. We expect this debate to continue for several hours with possible votes later today. Taking a look at Twitter, Democratic Congressman Alan Grayson.
Yes, that was C-SPAN 2, cutting away from their coverage at the peak of the debate, at the point where the British House of Commons was finally cutting through the bullshit and actually having a debate about the stuff that matters, the implications of an attack might have on the entire world. They cut away to tell us about congressional tweets. And then after they spent about 10 minutes telling us about the tweets, what did they deem to be more important than the live footage from the British House of Commons debating a matter of war? An interview with the Cheney family as they are promoting their book. I shit you not. Here's a clip.
My other favorite Richard story, he was in, I guess, in kindergarten. Came home from school one day and he told his mom, he said to Liz, he said, "Mom, tomorrow I have to stand up in front of the whole class and explain what's special about me. You know, why am I, Richard, special?" And she said, "Well, what are you going to say?" He said, "Well, I got two choices." And she said, "What are they?" And he said, "Well, I could say that my grandpa was Vice President of the United States." And she said, "Yeah, that's a pretty good answer. What's the other one?" He said, "I could tell him I got my cat at the dump." And yeah, and you can guess which one he used. So.
Grandpa Cheney, he's so charming. So yeah, that was all that I was able to get for you guys from American media. It's pretty sad and pathetic, but you know what? I think that's enough. We know what the British are going to do. They want to go, the next step is they're going to go to the UN, and it's going to take the same path, kind of, that Iraq did. So, you know, there are some questions that I definitely had. Most importantly, why Syria and why now? And so I was going on Twitter because I am also curious about the people in Syria and what they're saying about this situation. And so I found this one guy, and I don't know who he is, but he's definitely on Assad's side. So he's the enemy here. He's one of Assad's people. And he was saying stuff like the Americans don't know what they're talking about, and he seems pretty intelligent, and he has excellent English skills. And at one point, a couple days ago, he listed 12 things that he wanted the Americans to know. And he provided no links, nothing like that. So I went and researched these 12 things, and it turns out they're true. And this is where the selection of Syria and the fact that we're attacking them kind of gets shock doctrine-y. And because, you know, there are attacks places every day. In fact, I believe 35 people were killed in Afghanistan yesterday, and there was a big attack in Iraq where, I don't know, I think the death toll was like 80. And the official death toll that we just heard from, and there's no official death toll really from this chemical attack, but like between 200 and 350 people died from this chemical attack that all of a sudden warrants airstrikes. But the thing is, there have been 14 or so approximately chemical attacks in Syria over the past few months. But this is the one. This is the actual red line. And a lot of the common knowledge is that, a lot of the common wisdom that we're hearing is that the only reason that Obama is attacking right now is because he said that chemical weapons use is a red line, and he looks pretty bad if we don't attack him. So but I just find it really hard to believe that is the truth. When you attribute something like a war to a man's ego, it just seems a little simplistic. So what did one of the guys who's supporting the quote-unquote enemy think that we needed to know? Well, number 12, he said that Syria supports Hezbollah. Also, Syria supports the Palestinian resistance. Number 10 and number 9 were that Syria never accepted a peace treaty with Israel, and Syria is against Israel and Zionism. So clearly, Syria has aligned itself with the people we consider to be bad guys, and since we are the defenders and Israel can do no wrong in our official government policy, Syria being anti-Israel is also a problem. Number 8 is that Syria is against the New World Order, which, okay, whatever. Number 7, Syria is closely allied with Iran. And now I think we're getting somewhere because that is true. And we'll come back to that in a second. Number 6, Syria has water which is provided to neighboring countries. Also true. Turns out one of their biggest water sources is the Euphrates River, which goes from Turkey through Syria, and then the water goes to Iraq. And the thing is, if you think about it, Syria is an important place because they have water in the desert. It's the Middle East. So water is a precious resource there, and everybody who follows any kind of climate change knows that the desert is encroaching upon the places where they're able to actually grow their food. And in fact, Syria, they have a recent history of this becoming a big problem because a lot of people during a drought, not that long ago, just a few years ago, they had to leave their farmland because they couldn't grow anything. And so they've all been moving to the cities. And this influx of people going from rural areas into the cities is causing a lot of social unrest. Now, the other thing that Syria has, along with everyone else in the Middle East, is obviously fossil fuels. So number 5, Syria has natural gas. True. They have big reserves and American companies want in. Number 4, he says that Syria also has huge oil reserves. And this is true in a way. See, Syria is number 33 on the world's largest oil producers list. But even though they're pretty far down on that list, a third of their budget comes from their oil sales. It's $4 billion a year, which isn't chump change for a small-ish country. But it's not so much their production of oil and natural gas, but as their location for a transportation hub that I think is the key to why we are getting involved in Syria and why we care what Syria does about anything. In 2011, Assad announced a 4C strategy that would make it the transportation hub of pipelines that provide fossil fuel energy to Europe, an energy network linking the Mediterranean, the Caspian, the Black Sea, and the Persian Gulf. Here's the problem. Turkey wants to be that same hub, and they can only have one hub in the Middle East. It's either going to be Syria or their neighbor to the north, Turkey, and Turkey is our ally. And so get this timing, you guys. July 25th, 2011, Syria, Iraq, and Iran signed a $10 billion natural gas pipeline deal which would export Iranian gas through Syria's Damascus. And this plan cuts out Turkey entirely and, more importantly, defeats the purpose of U.S. sanctions. The 8th episode of Congressional Dish, we covered the National Defense Authorization, the NDAA, for 2013. And in that bill, which was signed into law, there were more Iran sanctions. And the Iran sanctions have everything to do with shutting down their nationalized oil industry. And every single time that Iran finds a way to export their fossil fuels, we put more sanctions on them to shut that down. And so what you had here is on July 25th, 2011, Iran made a deal with Syria and Iraq that would allow them to export their natural gas, which is a big no-no. Now, obviously, we just invaded Iraq 10 years ago, and so we can't really go back there and invade them again that quickly. You know, we've installed people, Saddam Hussein comes to mind, and then got rid of him when he stopped doing what we wanted. But 10 years, that's a quick turnaround, so we can't really punish Iraq. Syria, however, we can punish Syria for this. And the reason that I think this is the key is the dates. July 25th, 2011, this pipeline deal is signed. And in August of 2011, just less than a month later, President Obama says Assad has got to go. Now, if you think about this pipeline deal and the rhetoric of the Obama administration, they don't really need or necessarily want regime change because all they really want is for this pipeline to not happen. So if there was regime change, there is a chance that you get basically Al-Qaeda taking over Syria, and that's not going to do us much good. And plus, they might still ally with Iran and Iraq and put in the pipeline. So you don't necessarily want someone new, but a perpetual war, a really long civil war in Syria, will stop the pipeline from happening. Now, I have read a lot of accounts that are saying that Assad was pretty close to squashing the rebellion, or that he currently is. We haven't attacked him yet. And so he really doesn't want Western involvement because he's doing pretty good. And so just by knocking him back a peg, you keep the civil war going and you keep the pipeline from moving forward. But there's more bigger picture stuff here too. Moving on with this guy's list, you have number 3, Syria rejects Monsanto and all GMO foods. That's also true, and I didn't know that. And so what that means is that Syria is not going to be a willing trading partner with the monopoly agriculture businesses from the United States if they're not allowing the importation of GMO foods. Our State Department under Hillary Clinton was pushing hard for countries around the world to accept this GMO stuff on behalf of American multinational corporations. I mean, they're not really American, but they are what is controlling our government. So she's pushing for GMOs. Syria won't take them. That's a problem. And trade seems to be what really matters to the powers that be. Speaking of the powers that be, Syria also has no debt to the IMF. Now, the IMF, like I said before, and like was spelled out in the Shock Doctrine, they are able to control countries by putting those countries into crippling debt that they can never repay. And when they can't repay the debt, the IMF says, okay, we'll forgive some of it in return for these reforms that privatize your industries. Now, what happened in Syria is that Assad did some IMF reforms when he took office in 2001. But what's happening is that it's having the predictable bad effect for the poor and middle class in Syria. A lot of their small businesses are closing. This is a quote from Al Arabia online. I have this in the show notes. In Aleppo, about 9,000 small workshops have been producing shoes, mainly exporting, and there had been 10,000 others for textile manufacturing. Most of them are completely closed, unquote. There's also skyrocketing income inequality. This is from the LA Times. Quote, income inequality in Syria has increased during the last decade. Although the average monthly salary of employees jumped more than 20% between 2006 and 2009, the increase was canceled out by excessive inflation. In addition, wage increases benefit those with higher education degrees much more than less educated people who make up 60% of the labor force, unquote. So what you have here is a lot of people that are pissed off because they're getting poorer, and so they revolt. And what's happening in Syria is a civil war. And when bombs are put into cities, then their infrastructure gets destroyed. And this works for the IMF because then they can come in with humanitarian aid, just like the British were talking about. They can come in with humanitarian aid, provide GMO foods to the people, provide them with infrastructure to channel their water, and Syria can rack up massive debts to the IMF, which in return, they can use as leverage in demanding more free market reforms that open up their industries to private markets. Which brings me to the granddaddy of them all. Number 1 on this Syrian kids list was that Syria's central bank is state-owned. And this is a big no-no to the United States and to the countries who have been pushing this privatization of the world. See, right now, Syria's banking sector is dominated by 4 state-owned banks and includes 14 privately owned institutions. But even though Assad opened the door for some private banks back in 2001, Syria has been largely cut off from the global financial system because of international sanctions against Syria. Now, the IMF has put out instructions for what they want Syria to do, which includes, quote, having the central bank gain full control of existing direct instruments, unquote. And they say that the Syrian central bank should have, quote, operational independence and the institutional capacity to exercise effective banking supervision, unquote. So they essentially want every country in the world to have their own version of the Fed, because in our country, the Fed, which is a semi-public, private, creepy-ass institution, They're printing a ton of our money and deciding our economic policy, and we have no vote in what happens in the Fed, and we also aren't even told. We have no way to find out what they're actually doing with our money, and this is the system that they want for Syria. Now, why do I think that there's such a connection here? Well, if you look at the countries on our list, they all seem to have a central bank problem, because the countries that don't currently have an all-powerful central bank include Syria and Iran. And then there's some countries that used to have state-owned banks that now have central banks after we intervened in their country, and those include Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. And just to be very clear, these countries had central banks before, or maybe a version of it, but after we intervened, the central bank controlled their economy the way the Fed controls ours. So, what do I make of all this? Well, I certainly don't think the best way to stop Syrians from being killed is to kill more of them, but with just different weapons, because that's what this would do. That's what bombing does. We're going to kill Syrians. And I just don't think that that's an appropriate response if our true motivation is the fact that they're being killed by someone. And I just think that following the money makes more sense. So I don't really know if these are the true motivations of the Obama administration and the people that are going to actually be putting this in motion. But I definitely think this is information that we should have, that we should know that Syria has a state-owned banking system. And it'll be very interesting to see if we are pushing even harder after we give them aid money to rebuild what we bomb. If the central bank is going to be a condition in return for that aid, I also think that we should be watching this pipeline thing really closely. It wouldn't surprise me at all. And Iran is already saying that they're going to retaliate, because I think they know that maybe this is just a proxy war with Iran. This could be a way to shut down their export pipeline. And the timing, that timing is just ridiculous, you guys. This pipeline thing is signed on July 25th, and on August 18th, Obama says Assad has got to go. I just find that suspect. But even though every poll that I've seen seems to indicate that very few Americans want to do this Syrian attack thing, it looks like it's going to happen anyway. So I really just don't know what else to say.
Yeah, well, people, they try to tell me the ends justify the means. Well, I guess these people haven't ever listened to the screams. And there's clearly many questions that I really can't ignore. Like, is it a just war? Or is it just a war?
So yeah, that's it for today. I hope you guys have a great Labor Day. Speaking of Labor Day, fast food workers across this country were walking out of the job today because they are paid so poorly. They're asking for a $15 minimum wage, which I think they deserve. I think everybody deserves it. And if you want to boost the economy, well, give people money to spend. I think it's also a great idea. So you go, fast food workers. I have totally got your back. And yeah, enjoy your Labor Day weekend, and I will be back next week with the Department of Homeland Security funding bill from June. Take care, everyone.
Well, we went on in there looking for the WMD. Instead, we found a country that was practically empty, except for one commodity, of which they had plenty, enough to power Bush's fleet of cars for the next century. Yeah, I watch the world just step aside, waiting for their piece of the American pie. Yeah, and as Blair kisses Bush's butt and calculates his cut, NBC does his best to stir your patriotic feelings up. And as the people we're protecting, they pile up in the soil. I tell you this, my friends, blood